Jamaica.
In 2024, tourism reached $4.3 billion in revenue. But for every dollar that came in, only 40 cents actually stayed on the island. The government says this needs to change, and yet they've approved 10,000 new resort rooms by 2030. Many follow the same large-scale, all-inclusive structures that drives the leakage in the first place. A former butler turned union leader that I interviewed here on this channel called it
plantation tourism.
Where is Jamaica's tourism money really going? In this first part, we follow the money. Who owns the rooms, who controls the bookings, and where the profit actually goes. To understand why the 60 cents vanish, we have to look at economic leakage. That's the technical term for money that bleeds out of the local economy. Leakage in tourism happens in two main ways. First, imports. The breakfast buffet, the linens, the tile in the lobby, the wine, the imported steaks. If those things are not grown or made in Jamaica, then the money that's spent on them is essentially exported out the very moment that the order is placed. Second, fees and profits. Now, this is the part that most travelers never see. Management fees, franchise fees, brand royalties, booking systems. Profit that is sent back to foreign headquarters in Madrid, in Toronto, or in the United States. All of it legal, all of it standard practice. Now, put that next to the worker. Jamaica's national minimum wage is 16,000 Jamaican dollars a week, roughly 100 US dollars. Even when it rises to 17,000 Jamaican dollars in July, the math doesn't change. A worker would still need weeks of pay just to be able to afford a single night in a resort room that they just cleaned. And once you're inside an all-inclusive property, the system is also built to keep your spending there. Your meals, your drinks, your entertainment, and your transportation are already bundled. And at many resorts, the safety message is the same. Stay on property or stick to the approved tour operators, the ones that are already in the resort's sales system. What this means is that the independent restaurant down the road, the craft vendor 10 minutes away at the market, and the local taxi driver systematically get cut off. Economists call it the multiplier effect. That's when a dollar is spent locally and keeps moving. The taxi driver pays the grocer pays the farmer. But when a resort captures that spending inside its gates, at its own boutiques on site, at its own spas or restaurants, then the dollar stops moving. Resort workers do spend their money locally, their salaries, but at $2 to $4 an hour. And at properties where there's a no tipping policy, there isn't much left to circulate. To understand how all-inclusive resorts became so dominant in Jamaica, we have to go back to where it all began. The modern all-inclusive is often traced back to Club Med in the 1950s, Mallorca, tents on the beach, and bundled meals. But Jamaica's own history with it started earlier and more locally than most people realize. Frenchman's Cove in Portland opened in 1962, pioneering an ultra-luxury, one-price-covers-everything vacation that cost an astronomical 1,000 US a week. And that set the precedent for the self-contained resort. But it was Jamaican hoteliers who then took that concept and turned it into the all-inclusive industry that we know today. In 1949, Abe Issa, known as the father of Jamaican tourism, opened Tower Isle in Ocho Rios. The Issas are a Jamaican family whose roots trace back to Bethlehem and built a hotel and commercial dynasty in Jamaica. And they still operate couples resorts today. By the early 1970s, John Issa of the same family noticed that while global travel was in recession, cruises and Club Med were thriving because of their all-inclusive pricing. In 1976, he opened Negril Beach Village, and in 1978, he created the couples-only niche, converting Tower Isle into Couples Ocho Rios. All of this emerged during a very high-stakes political moment in Jamaica. In February 1976, the New York Times reported that hotels across Jamaica were losing tourists and bookings because of political violence in Kingston. By the early 1980s, airlines had even cut flights by 60%. In that crisis, the enclosed resort was sold internationally to travelers as protection from the country's outside volatility. So the gated resort grew in part out of this history.
Decades later, US and UK travel advisories are warning that the resort bubble is not automatically safe.
5 years after Negril Beach Village opened, Gordon Butch Stewart opened the first Sandals in Montego Bay. He took that adults-only, romance-branded luxury resort and expanded it across the entire Caribbean. So you see, the all-inclusive was not imposed on Jamaica from the outside. It was in part built from within, a local solution to a national crisis that eventually became the blueprint for the entire region. Then Spanish capital arrived and scaled the gated model into something else entirely. Riu opened in Jamaica for the first time in Negril in 2001. Bahia Principe followed as part of a larger wave of Spanish resort expansion in the Caribbean. So the question is no longer only who helped create the Caribbean all-inclusive, it is who owns the scale version of it now. That ownership question is also a land question. The very first tourists to Jamaica were the planters themselves, wealthy British sugar plantation owners who came in the 17th and 18th centuries. Much of Jamaica's tourism economy sits on coastal land shaped by those older estates and colonial patterns. As sugar declined and tourism grew, beachfront land became one of the most valuable assets in the country. So when we talk about all-inclusive resorts in Jamaica, we're talking about control over land, access to beaches, and profit. Here is what Jamaica's hotel market actually looks like today. The numbers really matter. Most hotel businesses in Jamaica are actually small, independent guest houses, boutique hotels, and villas. But a much smaller number of all-inclusives control where nearly 80% of tourists stay. All-inclusive resorts account for more than 21,000 of the country's 26,000 plus rooms, meaning roughly 4 out of every 5 hotel rooms in Jamaica is inside an all-inclusive resort. The concentration gets even sharper at the top. 48 properties with more than 200 rooms control nearly 3/4 of the country's hotel room inventory. And it's not just supply. 92% of overnight visitors who plan to stay in hotels in Jamaica in 2024 chose all-inclusive package plans. Among the most visible foreign-owned operators are Spanish groups, Riu, Bahia Principe, Iberostar. Riu works closely with European vacation package companies like TUI, meaning that much of the booking is actually locked in before the guest ever lands in Montego Bay. Bahia Principe, which is owned by the Spanish Grupo Piñero, opened one of Jamaica's largest resorts at Runaway Bay. Iberostar Group is a higher-end all-inclusive brand out of Spain as well. The more expensive the room, the more imported the experience. So even when the guest is actually spending more for this hotel room, the largest share of that spending can still leave Jamaica through overseas supply chains. Some imports are unavoidable in a small island economy, but leakage isn't only about what is imported. Ownership matters too, because you see, it decides where the profit goes after the vacation is paid for. A 2015 academic paper on Jamaica's all-inclusive resorts made the point very clear. When multinational companies dominate the sector, leakage increases because profits move out of the country and the local economy. Over the years, the companies have changed and the ownership structures are more and more complex. But Jamaica's tourism economy mostly still provides the labor and the natural resources of the country, while most of the goods, the brands, and the profits come from elsewhere, which is why tourism can grow while most of the money continues to leave the country. And Jamaica is not moving away from this all-inclusive resort model. Tourism officials have projected 10,000 new resort rooms by 2030, including major foreign-owned projects such as Moon Palace, Hard Rock, Unico, Palladium, Bahia Principe expansions, as well as Sandals properties, which are locally owned. The question now is not just who owns the rooms, but who controls the vacation that gets sold. The Spanish-owned mega resort is one type of resort architecture. Another is the Canadian vacation package. For years, Sunwing, for example, had an ecosystem that shows how all of this worked. A traveler could book a vacation package through Sunwing, fly on Sunwing Airlines, and then stay at a Royalton resort, which was then called Blue Diamond. All of that under the same traveler network. Today, the corporate names may have changed and shifted, but the structure is still very much the same. Sunwing is now part of WestJet Group. Blue Diamond has rebranded to Royalton Hotels and Resorts. But the vacation package logic remains intact. Travelers can still book through Sunwing Vacations, fly on a WestJet plane, and then get funneled into the all-inclusive resort property, bundled into a single Canadian sold transaction online. In a Sunwing search that I ran for November for a Jamaica vacation, foreign-owned mega resorts dominated the top of the results, while some Jamaican properties also appeared in the mix for Negril, which is known for its Jamaican-owned small hotels. but the booking to resort pipeline is still operating, which means that major parts of the profit margin are captured abroad by the tour operator, the airline, and the hotel system before the guest and the vacation even starts. What Jamaica receives is the local portion of the transaction: utilities, local payroll, taxes, visitor-related fees, money that is spent on local goods and supplies. Those revenues do matter, but they are still only one part of a much larger vacation payment. Spanish mega resorts, Canadian vacation packages, and then a third structure, one that changes who actually owns the buildings themselves. See, after the pandemic, major global hotel companies moved deeper into luxury all-inclusive resorts. I reported on this for Skift back in 2021. The all-inclusive was no longer just a budget package holiday. It had become a luxury growth strategy. Hyatt went big, buying Apple Vacations and later Playa Hotels and Resorts. Hilton, Marriott, and other brands also followed. The all-inclusive didn't just get bigger, it got more polished, more corporate. The Hyatt Playa Tortuga deal is a great example of this last year, and it shows what the shift looks like in real estate terms. In 2025, Hyatt acquired Playa Resorts, which was its longtime all-inclusive partner. Playa owned major resorts, real estate across Jamaica, Mexico, the Dominican Republic. 13 days after Hyatt announced the Playa acquisition, it turned around and announced a $2 billion sale of Playa's real estate portfolio to Tortuga Resorts. Now, in Jamaica, that portfolio includes major North Coast properties such as Hyatt Jiva, Rose Hall, Hyatt Zilara, Dreams Rose Hall. Tortuga Resorts, who it sold it to, is a joint venture between KSL Capital Partners and Rodina. KSL is a private equity firm based in Denver. Rodina is a Mexican family office. So Hyatt sold the buildings to them, but it kept the right to manage most of the resorts under 50-year management agreements. That is asset-light structure in plain English. Hyatt gets paid to run the resorts without the risk of owning the real estate. And this really does matter right now in Jamaica. Several Hyatt-owned properties and resorts in the Rose Hall area of Montego Bay remain closed after Hurricane Melissa. And this structure is not unique to Hyatt. Royalton Chic, Jamaica Paradise Cove, expected in Runaway Bay, shows the same layering. The same building is tied to the TUI Global Hospitality Fund. The resort is managed by Royalton, and the property will carry Marriott's Autograph Collection branding. One property, multiple foreign revenue streams. What this means for Jamaican hospitality workers at resorts is worth pausing on. When a brand operates a hotel but doesn't own the building, if the wages are too low, that's a management decision, most likely. If a property closes, that is an ownership decision also. In the end, workers can be easily squeezed between two parties, while outdated labor laws have failed to keep up with this evolution of all-inclusive resorts and corporate structures. So when a tourist books one of these rooms, they're not just buying a vacation. They're entering into a financial structure where the brand, the management, and the real estate ownership all sit outside of Jamaica. Large all-inclusives do bring jobs and airline seats. That's usually the defense from the government side and from within the industry. And it is not wrong. Large resorts create the volume that airlines require before they will even commit to routes. The industry also argues fairly that all-inclusive resorts are what attract volume of visitation that sustains this kind of employment in the first place. Tourism directly and indirectly employs approximately 1 in 4 Jamaicans, according to Jamaica's tourism ministry. That's a meaningful contribution to the national economy. But does volume alone justify 60% of leakage? It's important to say also that there are Jamaican workers and small operators who do support the all-inclusive resort structure and presence. It provides predictable income, training, in some cases and other benefits that informal tourism work often doesn't. But we have to remember that a job is not the same thing as a living wage. And if workers are earning $2 to $4 while guests are paying hundreds of dollars a night, then tourism growth alone can't be the answer. The ownership structures, by the way, that I've just walked you through in this section, shape what happens when disaster strikes in a tourism-dependent destination like Jamaica. Private equity can usually wait for as long as it takes for insurance, renovations, and reopening dates. But a housekeeper who lost her income last November can't. Jamaica is still building more resort rooms through the rest of the decade. So when someone says that Jamaica earned $4.3 billion in 2024 from tourism, the honest follow-up question should be not just how do we earn more, but who is the system really built to pay? Let me know in the comments what you believe the answer to that question to be. And in part 2, we'll look at the tourism workforce, some of the government programs that are meant to plug the leaks, and what travelers can actually do differently when visiting Jamaica. Consider subscribing for free and also joining as a member. I'm Lily, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.